All right, thank you, Jan, and thanks to the whole RECONNECT team for having me here, and to all of you for coming. It's a great honor to speak before you today. And I was asked to talk about challenges to democracy in the EU for about 20 minutes. So I'll do that, but since you invited me all the way over from the US, and we just had our Independence Day yesterday, I thought maybe I'd start by saying a couple things about American democracy before I move into EU democracy. So let's start with this. What do you think lice, root canals, and colonoscopies have in common? I'll tell you what they have in common. Polls showed they are all more popular than the US Congress, okay? And the US Congress is incredibly unpopular. In recent polling, basically the approval rates for Congress are in the teens, something between, sometimes it hits 20%, but it's usually between 13, 20% approval, 75, 80% disapproval, and higher. And yet, despite the overwhelming disapproval of Congress, right, the overwhelming majority of members of Congress are reelected, and usually by huge margins. Now, that reflects some of the challenges to American democracy, but there are many. I could talk all about it. I'm not going to go through things like low voter turnout. You were celebrating that voter turnout in the European Parliament election went above 50%, right? Well, I hope you all realize that turnout in European Parliament elections is always higher than turnout in US midterm congressional elections, which is usually in the 30s, right? Okay. Most House elections are uncompetitive, won by 10% or more, right? If you go down to the state level, talk about multi-level governance or federalism, the situation is much worse. In many of our state houses, our state legislatures, the seats aren't even contested by the two parties. So it's so gerrymandered that there's not a Democrat running against a Republican or vice versa. It's just decided in the primaries, right? Democratic Party can get millions more votes, right, in both congressional and presidential elections and still lose. So that's an issue. And then the Senate is, of course, a disaster in terms of democracy. And if you have the least populous states, with filibuster, you can have 11%, senators representing 11% of the population blocking legislation that's supported by senators who represent 89% of the population, right? So crazy things. And don't even get me started on Trump. Okay, so my point is all democracies have challenges, right? And the challenges, in the literature, there's some standard ones. There's challenges of representativeness. How do you make government representative of the diverse views among its citizenry? Accountability. How do you make government accountable to its citizens? And then effectiveness. How do you make government work and deliver and be effective in its policies? So these are common, and of course EU member states, we'll get to that, they have challenges. It wouldn't be fair to kick someone when they're down, but of course British democracy, is a dumpster fire right now. So okay, so there's problems all over. Now federal democracies like the EU, so just bear with me, maybe you don't think the EU is a federation exactly, but it's quasi-federal, let's say. So federal democracies have, in addition to the standard challenges, a particular set of challenges. First, there's tensions between federalism and democracy, inherent tensions, because you can have majorities at one level of government, let's say state level, who want a certain policy, where the majority at the federal level wants the opposite policy, right? So you can have one majority imposing its will over the other majority, right? And that creates these tensions, right? Where local majorities might feel like, oh, well, it's not fair that this is a federal competence because then we don't get what we want locally, or vice versa. And then, it's difficult to maintain a healthy democracy at both levels. If people's attention is all focused at state level democracy, then the federal level may suffer, or vice versa. If the attention all goes to federal level democracy, local democracy might suffer. And the most extreme version of this problem of maintaining democracy at both levels is the phenomenon, which is quite common around the world, of having within federal democracies, having certain states within that federal union that are authoritarian, right? So it's actually quite common, as we'll explain, to have authoritarian states within what are broadly democratic unions. And with that in mind, the main message I have, and what I'm going to talk about today, is that largely in the EU literature on the democratic deficit, that term we all know, I think scholars have been focused on the wrong level of government, right? It's not to say that the EU doesn't have its flaws or its democratic deficits. EU-level democratic deficits exist, but they've been exaggerated in the literature. I'll talk a little bit about legitimacy and accountability of the EU. What's been underestimated is the deficits of democracy at the member state level, right? And the emergence and the backsliding, which Professor Wouters talked about, toward authoritarianism at the national level. So let's just start with the EU level. You know, the standard line, oh, the EU lacks legitimacy. I don't have time to talk about it much, but my basic question would be, well, compared to what? Certainly doesn't lack legitimacy compared to most national governments. You know, polling consistently shows that trust in the EU, right, and in various EU institutions tends to be higher than trust in national governments, national parliaments, national parties. There are some exceptions, certain countries where that's not true, but on average across the EU it is, right? So in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, right? So the EU, people may not love it, right, but in general, they like it just as much as national governments. So, you know, that's about legitimacy. Now, how about the issue of choice and accountability? You know, the standard critique in the democratic deficit literature is, well, democracy means you have to be able to, you know, throw the bastards out, right? You have to be able to get rid of a government you don't like through an election. It's the essence of democracy. People say, well, you can't do that in the EU, so it's undemocratic. There's an element of truth to that, right? There's something there, of course. But what I would emphasize is that that kind of argument is based on a misunderstanding of the nature of EU democracy, because that understanding is based on a kind of majoritarian model of democracy. The idea, well, you're going to have an election, you know, in the most extreme form, it's a Westminster style, or, you know, but even if it's not Westminster, it's this idea, you're going to have one election and change the government, right, through that election, replace one political party or coalition with another. But the EU is a consensus democracy. And in fact, the Dutch-American political scientist Arend Leipart, in his classic book about patterns of democracy, uses as his exemplar of consensus democracy, not the Netherlands, right? He uses the EU, right, as the exemplar in contrast to, let's say, the British Westminster system of a consensus democracy. And that means it's a democracy in which many elected officials in different institutions and at different levels of government have to compromise and reach consensus in order to govern. So it's not about, you know, these narrow majorities, but about building a broad consensus. And so that means, of course, when you're involving multiple parties, multiple levels, you're not going to just replace government from one day to the next with one party taking over for the other. Now that can be frustrating because it can feel like things never change, but it doesn't mean it's undemocratic. And just as an aside, I know the first panel is going to talk more about the Spitzenkandidat process and things like that, but it's worth noting how this insight sort of relates to the Spitzenkandidat process and the talk about a political commission. All this fixation on electing, so to speak, you know, the commission president, it would sort of suggest or rely on a majoritarian model where you think, well, it matters what party the president of the commission comes from. But let's keep in mind, the commission is always going to be a multi-party body because the other commissioners will be appointed from governments, right, with different parties. So we don't want to fixate on the idea that it's just one party running the commission. It's going to be more essentially like the Swiss federal executive, right? Like a collective executive representing different party families. All right, but let's go to the big challenge. So what I'm saying is we've exaggerated the EU problems, but what we've underestimated, as I said, is authoritarianism at the national level. So the biggest challenge to EU democracy right now is democratic backsliding or the rise of authoritarian regimes. So one member state already, Hungary, has become what scholars would call a competitive authoritarian regime. Poland is moving rapidly in the same direction. Several other member states have deeply problematic democracies and have faced recent crises. Now, what do I mean when I say competitive authoritarianism? Some of you might want to say, oh, isn't it an illiberal democracy? I think that's a nonsense term. We can talk about that. Competitive authoritarianism is a system of government. It's not a dictatorship. We're not talking about North Korea. We're not even talking about Russia. But what we're talking about is a system that does hold elections, but in which the ruling party rigs the system in everything from its control of media to control of courts to electoral commissions and electoral rules in such a way that the playing field is tilted so heavily as to nearly guarantee victory. And there's a huge literature in political science about these regimes. And in fact, most authoritarian regimes these days are more along this model than a kind of hardcore dictatorship. And, you know, don't take my word for it. The very scholars who came up with the term competitive authoritarianism, and Levitsky and Way from Harvard and Toronto, you know, they recently wrote about how the Hungarian government is the perfect example, right, a prime example of competitive autocracy. So the big central challenge or the puzzle then is, why does the EU, which professes a commitment to democracy and the rule of law, tolerate member governments becoming or sliding toward the status of competitive authoritarian regimes? It's a big question. Well, the first thing I'd say, and a lot of people, a lot of my friends in this community have been like shocked about these developments. But my first message would be, we shouldn't be surprised, right? Because in fact, this is very common around the world, this phenomena of having authoritarian state enclaves within democratic unions, right? Ed Gibson from Northwestern has written a lot about this in Latin American context, saying that subnational, by which he means state authoritarian regimes, are a fact of life in developing and post-communist countries. And this is especially true, as the second quote shows you, in large heterogeneous federations. That sounds a lot like the EU, doesn't it? Large and heterogeneous. So why? Why do these enclaves of authoritarianism emerge and survive within federal unions? There are three main reasons. Okay? Party politics, funding from the center, and emigration. And I'm going to talk about each of those, but then I have an even more depressing message. It's not just that we shouldn't be surprised, it's that the EU is in fact in worse shape than all these other federations that have authoritarian states because it's trapped in what I've called an authoritarian equilibrium, which I'll explain. Okay, so parties. We're familiar with this in the US because we had it for a century where we were the great democracy of the world, except that we had authoritarianism in many of our states in the South with systematic disenfranchisement of voters, one-party states, right, that were, it's not just that they were racist, which they were, of course, but it's also that they weren't real democracies because they weren't allowing free and fair elections, right? Now, how did that survive for nearly a century in the US? Because they were one-party states run by Democrats, and they were protected by the federal Democratic Party, who blocked any action against them from the federal level. Why? Because they delivered votes that Democrats needed to win control of Congress and to win presidencies, right? So that was the deal. You can run your little authoritarian regime in your state as long as you deliver in Washington. So when is democracy restored in those kind of situations like I described there in the US? Well, what the literature says is, it can be restored through party politics when the party sponsor, the federal party who's protecting their local autocrat, when they find that costly, when it becomes embarrassing, when it starts hurting their reputation and making them lose votes elsewhere, then they might intervene to oust the autocrat and help restore democracy. Or when the opposition parties at the federal level go in and help the local beleaguered opposition and support them to restore democracy and competition at the state level. Well, here's the problem with the EU, and I'll slide in toward the authoritarian equilibrium in a minute, but first I want you to just think about things that are half-baked, okay? The problem with party politics in the EU is that it's a half-baked system, right? These Euro parties, they're half-developed. Now, sometimes half-baked things can be delicious, like my picture of a molten chocolate cake, right? But sometimes half-baked things can be poisonous, like an undercooked chicken sandwich, which then carries salmonella and can kill you. And the point I want to get across is that the half-baked character of Euro parties and EU-level party politics is proving poisonous to national democracy. Why? Because we have these half-baked Euro parties, right? We've all seen their handiwork in the past week, right? What's the problem? Okay, and Alberto's right here in the front row. He's written a lot about this. Euro parties are not real parties, okay? They not only do they not have the famous transnational lists, they don't appear on ballots. I'm not a European, I didn't vote, you all voted, right? No one saw a Euro party on their ballot because they're never there. You vote for national parties, right? Few voters even know they exist, these Euro parties, right? And fewer even still know who the different national members are, right? So do CDU voters in Germany really know, let's say, that Fidesz was an ally with CDU and the EPP? Maybe a few of them, right? Do Belgian liberal voters know that Babiš in the Czech Republic is in their Euro party? I doubt it. So why does that matter? Because there are many incentives for mainstream parties to protect what I call pet autocrats, or these democratic backsliders, parties that want to move in that direction, so that they can make their Euro party bigger, right? And so they can add to their coalition, right? There's huge incentives for that. But while there are those incentives, there are no punishments, because there's no brand damage that you really suffer from having an unsavory pet autocrat in your Euro party, right? You know, the American Republicans, at least some of them like get embarrassed sometimes by unsavory characters, but not lately. But you know, there's no brands for, you know, ALDE, right? These kind of things, right? So there's no embarrassment. And also, by the way, Euro parties are prohibited from funding their local affiliates, so they can't go help oppositions who are being oppressed. All right, so you know, there's been a perverse consequence then of the efforts to democratize the EU to address the supposed EU-level democratic deficit. EU leaders have tried to make the EU more partisan, more democratic, by making Euro parties and European Parliament elections more important, and through the Spitzenkandidat process, right? So that was the effort to address the democratic deficit. But what I want to say is, you know, that had a perverse consequence, because that increased the incentives for parties to tolerate these, you know, members who are backsliders. There's a lot to win by doing it. But again, you know, there's no punishment, and so, or no downside risk. So democratizing the EU-level politics has helped make the EU a haven for national autocrats. Okay, so just to run through, you know, why has the EU failed to intervene in Hungary? There's lots of reasons, but the biggest reason is the EPP protection, of course, for years. That's the number one reason, right? You know, Fidesz is a member of the EPP still, okay, still. We can talk about the suspension, it's bogus, but you know, they're still members of the EPP group in the parliament, voting with them. They deliver seats that support the EPP in the parliament. They hold key positions. An Fidesz member was just elected vice president of the parliament, right? EPP leaders often stick together in the council, so they shelter Orban from EU action. Maybe it'll change, we'll see, but not yet. You know, we've had all the talk about Weber this week, and he's claiming in the newspaper interview yesterday that he was failed to become, you know, the president of the commission because he was stopped by Macron and Weber. I mean, this is, or sorry, Macron and Orban. This is ridiculous. So maybe we'll get to that in a later panel. But in fact, he has defended and campaigned actually for Orban, you know, for years, right? You know, he tweets his congratulations to him, etc. But it's not just the EPP. As I alluded to earlier, all the Euro parties nearly, I don't think the Greens have one, but many of them have pet autocrats. ECR has Kaczynski, Socialists had Dragnia until he got arrested, right? ALDE has Babiš. We'll see what happens with him. But you know, there are many of these you know, problematic member parties. Okay? And by the way, you know, I had some hope for Renew Europe, Macron's new grouping. They said they were going to have principles and not work with, you know, parties that would have these problematic member parties. That lasted about a week, right? Because they voted just the other day for a Fidesz member to become, you know, vice president of the European Parliament. So there's that. Okay, so enough on parties. Jan, do I still have 5 minutes or so? Yeah. What's the other two pillars of this equilibrium? Second one is money, right? EU funding. Maybe those of you who've studied political science have all heard of the resource curse, the way like having oil can be bad for democracy, because if you have a source of rents that come into the government, it incentivizes corruption, but also means you don't have to rely so much on satisfying taxpayers because you have this external source of money as the government. And anyway, it's called the resource curse. Well, substitute, instead of oil wells, the oil well in the EU case is structural funds, EU money. It functions as a kind of resource curse that can undermine democracy. Again, paradoxically, it's supposed to be helping countries, right? But instead what happens is local authoritarians can use their control of incoming EU money to prop up clientelistic networks, right, and their regimes. And so you have all these stories in Hungary about how, you know, the government taps European taxpayers to bankroll family and friends using EU money for these projects. My favorite picture ever on this is when Orban was having his Stop Brussels rally, right? And you know, someone noticed that he was busing in people to this protest in vans, you know, that were co-financed by the EU, right? So, you know, basically you're paying, you know, for someone to thumb their nose at democratic values. Okay. Then the other one is emigration. And I didn't mean immigration, which I'll talk about emigration, right? Moving out. There's a big literature since the great political economist Albert Hirschman wrote about this back in the 70s, about how emigration could help sustain authoritarianism. Because essentially, you know, he had his famous book on exit, voice, and loyalty, and essentially his insight was, if dissatisfied citizens can leave easily, that can be a pressure release valve, right, for a regime to help it survive, right? Because instead of being trapped at home, now that would be bad for them, that's not good for individual freedom, but it might lead to an explosion, right? And by the way, that played a big role in the US. I showed you the 100 years nearly of authoritarianism in the South. That was accompanied by the emigration of millions of African Americans out of the South to the North and the Midwest, right, to escape that situation. And that kind of helped it to survive in those states, right? So, this happens in the EU as well, because a lot of the emigration that's happening within the EU, free movement of people, is happening, it's not exclusively, of course, but a lot of it's happening from countries that are backsliders. They also tend to be less wealthy and more unemployment, things like that. But they're backsliders, and people can escape those situations by moving to other member states. So EU membership, free movement of persons, facilitates exit, right? Therefore decreases voice. Backsliders see a lot of emigration. Just to take the Hungarian example, the numbers are murky, but at least, and probably many more, but at least a couple 100,000 people have emigrated since Orban took power. They tend to be young, educated, likely opponents of the regime. And then the other key distinction, member governments have total control over electoral processes. There is no EU Voting Rights Act, right? Like we saw that in Britain, where they disenfranchised all these people in the European Parliament election, right? But it also means that if you're an immigrant, your government controls whether or not, or how easily or how difficult it is for you to vote back in your home country's national elections. So governments can make it hard for the people to vote. And if you take that example I gave from America, when African Americans left the South and moved to the North, they became national voters there and became a big voting bloc, right, eventually for the civil rights and things. But the people leaving, backsliders, don't get to vote really once they leave, right, in any national elections. And so, that's a problem. And I'm just going to show you one chart. This even shocked me when I did this research. It's in a forthcoming paper. That is the percent change in adults living in other EU member states, right, since 2010, right? So you see that by more than twofold, the biggest increase in the percent of adult citizens living in another EU member state since 2010 has been in Hungary, right? And so, that helps the government when that happens, and then very few of those people vote, okay? All right, so I'm going to conclude, wrap up in the next minute or so. The EU is in this half-baked authoritarian equilibrium. It's kind of the opposite of Goldilocks. Goldilocks was the porridge is not too hot, it's not too cold, it's just right. Well, I'm saying the EU doesn't have too much democracy or too little. It has just the wrong amount, right, where it can be poisonous, right? And as I said, just to summarize, there's enough partisan politics to shield autocrats, but not enough development of democracy and partisan politics to help dislodge them. But meanwhile, the autocrats can use EU money, and so far there's been really no conditions attached to it, right? In terms of rule of law. We'll see if there are in the future, but there haven't been. And then meanwhile, a lot of opponents just say it's easier to just leave than to fight. I see some fighters here in the audience, but not everyone stays and fights. All right, yeah, Orban's Fidesz remains in the EPP up till this day. And the last two slides, I just say, the EU is stuck in this equilibrium and the rot is spreading, right? For now, it seems like similar trends. Maybe we got a reprieve in Romania with the arrest of Dragnea, but there's problems in Bulgaria, Malta, other member states. So unless there's big change on the horizon, I'm afraid that the message is rather negative. Well, if you're an autocrat, it's positive. The message is you can probably get away with it, for now, right? Is there any reason for optimism? I guess the last thing I'll say, some of my friends have seen this slide before, but I guess the only optimistic thing you can say is, being in the EU, means that these regimes don't go all the way to sort of Erdogan or Putin levels, right? The EU does, that would really, would probably provoke a reaction. So you can maybe view that as a positive, that the EU stops governments from going into full dictatorship, right? But as long as you're a soft authoritarian regime that avoids violence, you can probably get away with it. So, my dad taught me a saying years ago, there are many drinks between urine and champagne. So maybe we have to be satisfied by the fact that while the EU will tolerate soft authoritarian regimes, maybe it doesn't let them slide into outright dictatorship. Thank you very much.